Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening of the Cultural Intelligence Center. And we also have a very special guest, Marsha Ramroop, the very first Director of Inclusion at the Royal Institute of British Architects. RIBA is what we're going to refer during the webinar. Marsha will share how she's building her diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy from the ground up. She will give you an inside look at how RIBA is implementing CQ foundationally and practically with more than 55,000 members around the world. Following Marsha's presentation, Dave will ask her some very pertinent and interesting questions. I will then get the opportunity to grill them both before we open the floor to the audience and your questions. Now, before I hand over the mic to Marsha, I just want to say we have two special announcements at the end of the webinar, so please stay on. Thank you very much, and Marsha, over and out to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ritika. I'm just going to share my screen with you and hopefully you'll be able to see that. Let me know when that's live. Hopefully you can see it shortly. Great, perfect. So, as Ritika says, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you are. Before I start talking about the strategy and the model, which we've written into a white paper and is going to be available for you, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for turning up, for being engaged in this area. Thank you for clearly wanting to make a difference, to create real change. And thank you for listening to what I've got to say on this matter of equity, diversity, and inclusion, using CQ as a foundational piece. And for clarity, I will shorten equity, diversity, and inclusion to EDI, which is the preferred British acronym. Just stop to share for a second. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. I have been more nervous today speaking to you than I have been for quite some time about this presentation. And I was reflecting, why is that? And I realized—
Marsha, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but a number of people are saying they're having a hard time hearing you. So if we could just get your radio voice a bit louder. My apologies, everyone, for the interruption. Just as Marsha was telling us, she was daunted by doing this.
How are you doing? Can you hear me more clearly now?
Yes, thank you so much. I will quit interrupting you now.
That's okay. Dave, you know, you and I, we can do this to each other.
Absolutely.
So just to reiterate that I'm going to use EDI as the acronym for Equity, Diversity and Inclusion, which is the preferred British acronym. And I was just saying that I'm actually more nervous today speaking to you than I have been before any other presentation that I've done, and I do them all the time. And I was reflecting, you know, why is that? And I realized that being able to share these ideas with you is a real example of privilege, the privilege of having this kind of platform of this size to share these ideas is unusual for me. And the privilege of being able to use my voice for those voices that are unheard is my personal mission and purpose. And as such, I really didn't wish to take such an opportunity for granted, and I really don't want to waste it. So I won't pull my punches, which, given that's an idiom, I will use my CQ and explain that I mean to say I will be quite blunt, I'll be quite direct with what I have to say, so you not only understand the real opportunity there is here for real change, but the part that you must play in delivering it. Now, clearly, one of the reasons why you're here is that you want to know how. How do you move forward when you know that you want to be better at EDI and you're trying stuff, but you're not really getting You're not really creating that sustained and sustainable change that you'd like. How? How do you take personal responsibility, and how do you guide your organization forward? Now, Amanda Gorman, in the poem that she wrote for the inauguration of US President Joe Biden, The Hill We Climb, she asked the question, when day comes, we ask ourselves, where can we find light in this never-ending shade? Well, dare I suggest it? This is the question that the inclusive culture pyramid seeks to address. The Cultural Intelligence Center research confirms that having a mix of people in an organization isn't enough to create better outcomes. You need an inclusive culture too. Of course, it's not only the right thing to do to treat other humans well, not just the ones who are like ourselves, but the benefits are tangible, and a better, more equitable society would be a joy for us all to live in. But in addition, the statistics show that inclusive leaders make employees feel 84% more motivated. Organizations with inclusive culture are 8 times more likely to have overall better business outcomes, 6 times more likely to be innovative, twice as likely more to exceed financial targets, 3 times as likely to be high performing, and it goes on. And implementing the inclusive culture pyramid into an organization to drive effective EDI outcomes is quite straightforward to describe. First, we build a solid foundation where CQ is a stepping stone to an intersectional approach to leading inclusion and effectively managing diversity. CQ serves as a behavioral model, if you like, for individuals and teams. It has to start with the most senior leadership to ultimately inform all the actions in an organization. And concurrently, to create equitable outcomes, the inclusive behaviors need to be embedded as a change strategy into the organization. And I've identified the McKinsey influence model as being particularly useful and successful. And I'll be sharing the slides on this in just a moment. This needs to be implemented for individuals, cascaded to teams, departments, and fed into the organization overall. And to bring about sustained and sustainable inclusive change, you need to apply this new way of thinking and working across all 4 areas of the business. So how you attract people into your organization, how you treat and progress your staff, how you create the services and products of your business, and how you engage your users, customers, clients, audience, members, whoever you're outreaching to. And I like to say that conceptually, you can imagine this approach. What I'm describing is easy to visualize. And I like to ask you to envisage it like a bag of sand. But when you rip open a bag of sand, it's a very granular, very detailed piece of work to do. So one grain of sand might be a menopause policy, another might be setting up staff networks, another might be ensuring you have a robust whistleblowing policy, another could be ensuring you have easy access to your workplace for those with physical needs, and on it goes. But there are some big pieces we can put in place, and CQ behaviors are foundational. But they have to stay in place and be constantly pushed back into position. Otherwise, all the other pieces will fall apart. Now, I will explain specifically how I'm implementing this at the RIBA a little bit later on in this webinar, but I'd like to make a very important point, that it's really important to have support to help your staff implement their CQ learning. Now, I've brought in specific transfer of learning into action coaching to assist with this at the RIBA, and a bit more detail on that later. But let me talk to you about the model that I've described in a very high-level way. CQ, cultural intelligence. Q stands for quotient, as it's a measure as well as a skill. It's the capability to work and relate effectively, I like to say, with people who are different from you. And when applied properly, it forces us to consciously and deliberately challenge ourselves and the perspectives that we're taking and the systems we're succumbing to that allow discrimination to happen in the first place. This behavioral change piece is how we break the cycle of our bias, supporting the systems which perpetuate in society, which reinforce our bias, and very little changing, which leads to diversity fatigue. And I know, even as you listen to this, it might even be rearing its head. So how do we move forward? Sorry, apologies. CQ is comprised of 4 capabilities: CQ drive, CQ knowledge, CQ strategy, and CQ action. And these 4 capabilities were discovered when researchers asked the question, what's the difference between those that succeed in today's multicultural, globalized world and those that fail? Essentially, what's the difference between success and failure when we're working with those who are different from us? And the outcome of questioning across the world, tens of thousands of participants, was a high degree of these 4 attributes. And it starts with wanting to. Do you actually want to work and relate with those who are different from you? CQ drive. And when you don't want to, how do you motivate yourself to do the work required? Now, CQ drive, like all the CQ capabilities, have subcategories to help pinpoint the areas that need work. The subcategories here are intrinsic motivation, extrinsic motivation, and self-efficacy. Now, those intrinsic and extrinsic motivators, deriving enjoyment from the task itself, of interacting, supporting, enhancing the lives of those different from you, or gaining reward for, or fearing repercussions of not doing so. You know, that's fairly straightforward to understand. But I want to spend a moment emphasizing self-efficacy here. So much of our ability to be effective at doing better around EDI is tied up in fear. Fear can be paralyzing for some. Fear of cancel culture, fear of doing the wrong thing. Now, I've stopped saying that you need to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. Instead, I think it's more useful to consider leaning into your discomfort. Recognize it, be conscious about it, see it as a conscious opportunity to learn and to grow. We will get things wrong. We always do. It's a human reaction. It's human nature. However, how we react to our mistakes is a mark of high CQ and high self-efficacy. We must listen to those telling us that we've got it wrong. Listen and learn. Reflect on that and move forward differently. Hands aloft, acknowledging that there's room for improvement. Now, this approach does tend to prevent the outcome of being cancelled. The other capabilities now are, what do you need to know in order to respect and value the difference that you come across? How do you ensure everyone has access to information as you gather it? This is CQ knowledge. And because you can never know everything about everyone, I say this is why it's so important to surround yourself with a diversity of lived experiences. How do you plan for your interactions with others? What amount of time do you give your staff for adjustment? How do you check your assumptions? Are you aware of who you are and what you're bringing to the party, as it were? This is CQ strategy. How do you put these into action? Are there communication modes there so people can openly provide feedback, calling out issues and biases? How do we adapt in any given circumstance with those who are different from us? This is CQ action. And that's the foundational piece. Like I said, we then use this as a behavioral piece and overlay it with the McKinsey influence model of change, which is proven to be 8 times more successful at embedding change when you have all 4 cornerstones used rather than just one. So fostering understanding and conviction, there's clarity as to why the inclusive change is needed. People understand why they're being asked to make the change, and it makes sense to them. And there's also the data piece of work here, ensuring that we have robust tracking and monitoring coming in here. How your staff are developing their skills and talents. Are they getting the training they need to help them understand the change? They have the opportunity to behave in the new and inclusive ways. Appraisals, they have inclusive objectives baked into them, and they're supported and they're held accountable, preferably with support like the transfer of learning into action coaching that I mentioned earlier. Role modeling, people are more likely to change their behaviors and mindset if their leaders and colleagues are behaving in a new way. And this is why it's so important to start with the absolute echelons of your organization, the senior CEO, executive, senior leadership. And are the policies and structures in place allowing us to reinforce with formal mechanisms, whether that's about recruitment, pipeline schemes, mentoring, clarity of vision, mission, organizational goals, policies? All of these need to have inclusion with CQ behaviors baked into them. When we implement this then at individual, team, departmental and organizational level across the 4 areas of the organization, we attract people into our businesses, how we educate them, how we treat and retain and progress staff, how we develop and deliver the services, and how we attract our users, customers, clients, members, etc. This is an intersectional approach where we're not just looking at race over there and disability over here and sexuality over there and gender over there. We're asking, what is it about me which means that I can find it difficult to work with you? And when we do that, we can really start to think about how we move forward. Now, I say that the language of CQ in itself is not confrontational, but the level of introspection required can be uncomfortable. And we need to practice and exercise our inclusion muscle to become stronger. And so it becomes easier. And the inclusive culture pyramid requires us to engage in a cognitive evolution so we can create procedures to mitigate the impact of hidden bias. All of this works and model each individual owning and taking personal responsibility for their role is a reason to have hope. We can achieve that tangible change. And the power of one is power multiplied indeed. And this message of hope that comes from the form of personal responsibility, I sometimes use Kamala Harris, which I've put in the white paper, or Martin Luther King. But to finish, I'd just like to revisit the words of Amanda Gorman and The Hill We Climb. She concluded, "We will rebuild, reconcile and recover in every known nook of our nation, in every corner called our country, our people, diverse and beautiful. We will emerge, battered but beautiful. When day comes, we step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. A new dawn blooms as we free it, for there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it." Thank you for listening.
Marsha, thank you. I wish we were in a live room where people could erupt with applause in that. So thank you for that. And I'm sure there's going to be all kinds of questions about the conceptual information you shared and how you're actually doing this at RIBA. So we'll give you all an opportunity to ask some questions in a bit, and you can even start using the Q&A now, as some of you had. But before we jump to everyone else's questions, you and I have a lot of history together, so let's just have a chat a bit and kind of talk about who's the person behind all this great kind of model that you've laid out there. So when you and I first met, you were a journalist with the BBC. In fact, the vast majority of time that we've known together, you were with the BBC, and now you're leading diversity efforts with RIBA, the Royal Institute of British Architects. Talk to us a little bit about your professional journey. How does one who was a journalist suddenly end up leading diversity efforts?
Yes, I had a 30-year career in broadcasting. In fact, December would have marked 30 years since I did my first live radio show. And I always wanted to work in radio, and it was all about me because I love the sound of my own voice. But I matured. And as I grew in my journalism, it became really, really important to me to that motto that I have for myself, giving the unheard voice a place to speak. So as a journalist, I was very much focused on going out in communities and without an agenda and listening and hearing different stories. And I try to encourage that methodology, not only in how we approach our audiences, but how we approach our content and how we approach the different ways we went about recruitment and everything else. And so in an effort to try to do this more, I set up my own inclusion consultancy a few years ago called Unheard Voice. And I developed this strategy with Unheard Voice. And when I saw the opportunity to work with the RIBA as a director of inclusion, I thought, I want that job. And the reason why I said I want that job is because architecture is so important in the way that we shape our lives. And it's so funny, I just went down to the kitchen. I'm here at the headquarters of 66 Portland Place, the RIBA in London. And there's a quote on this mug from Winston Churchill, and it says, "We shape our buildings and thereafter our buildings shape us." And with architecture having that power to shape us, how important is it, therefore, that those buildings are inclusive so they can shape us in an inclusive way? And that is why I applied for this role, because architecture, our president, Simon Alford, described it as the backdrop to the theatre of our lives. And therefore, let me influence the creation of inclusive spaces and therefore change the world.
So much to unpack with that. And yeah, the theme of your life of giving voice to the unheard voices is something that I've gained so much from talking with you about personally and professionally throughout the years. I know even in your journalistic career, it was kind of, but how do we broadcast the voices that aren't getting heard? And there's a lot of talk right now about the tragedy that's just happened to this young woman in the US who was found and presumed to potentially be killed by her boyfriend in a national park, and it's raised again the question of, but what about all the individuals who don't look like her, who go lost all the time, whose voices we never hear about, etc. So, but let's get even more personal. So. We both use the "where are you from" video and joke about it in our training, but an unfiltered observer might look at Marsha and go, so are you British? Like, you don't look like what I thought about in terms of British. So talk to us a little bit about your own cultural identity.
I dare say I am British.
Okay, fair enough.
The observer is definitely unfiltered. Yes, I am British, although it's an identity that I have struggled with a bit, to be honest. And my parents are Trinidadian. I'm wearing red, white, and black today. Trinidadian colours, you. And when they were born, actually, Trinidad was a British colony, so they were born British and were brought up British as well. But I prefer to say I'm a woman of the world, because political lines drawn on maps aren't necessarily the way that I choose to identify myself. But yeah, Britain is a very mixed place with lots of diversity, racial diversity, and every other part, with the 60 million people in the UK. So yeah, people like me, people who don't look like me. And funnily enough, I like to use a statistic, because we think about Britishness maybe as being white, male, heteronormative, men based in London and the Southeast, as being certainly that demographic is the demographic that hold authority in the UK. But that demographic, white male, heteronormative, able-bodied, and based in London Southeast, only make up 3.1% of the UK population.
Wow.
So there is serious underrepresentation going on.
Thank you. So let's talk a little bit more specifically about RIBA. So you gave us this very compelling insight into the work that you've laid out, but you're really new at RIBA. It's 6 months. To help me with the
just over 7 months now.
7
yes.
months. Okay. So you're now in your current role at RIBA, and we hear the passion behind it, but practically, like, where do you even get started with this? And for a lot of our attendees who probably don't have a clue what RIBA is, maybe just give us a quick snapshot, other than we know you deal with architecture, but what is RIBA and where do you even begin with an organization that I happen to know from interacting with you is massive in terms of membership?
Yeah, so the Royal Institute of British Architects is nearly 200 years old. It's a membership organisation. I feel like I need the corporate line here. my colleagues in RIBA marketing will say, Marsha, make sure you say this and that. The RIBA, let me make sure that I get this right. It's a global professional membership body. It serves its members and society in order to deliver better buildings, places, and stronger communities in a sustainable environment. And there are about 300 staff and 55,000 members globally. But the profession of architecture is known for being, quite white, male, older, and the progression of underrepresented groups is something that I've been brought in to try to help with, because you've got a good mix of people wanting to enter the profession, but they're not necessarily entering it, and or dropping off at various stages. So that's definitely something that I'm looking at. And in terms of, well, in the first 7 months, what do? You've got this massive organization. How do you go about it? Well, from day one, when I was doing my interview, I was like, this is the model, this is what I'd want to do, and this is how I'd like, to do it. So if you're going to hire me, this is what I'm going to do. So I started with the exec team, a very engaged, very brilliant group of people who said, yes, Marsha, we're open to CQ. So we did the assessment. We did they did a workshop, a CQ workshop, leading the CQ workshop with me, and they've had the coaching as well, which I'll explain a little bit more about in a second. I did that again with the senior management team, another group of 40 people. And then I'm cascading to the rest of the staff, the CQ assessment and e-learning, and the coaching is coming in the form of an AI app that they're able to use to be coached through implementing their learning. Now, the transfer of learning into action coaching that I've also brought in to help implement the CQ learning has been crucial to bringing about actual change. It's put together by Emma Webber at Lever Learning, and she is a global leader in the transfer of learning into action. And what she says is that, 20% of the time people don't implement what they learn in training sessions. The other 65% of people want to implement it, but they get back into the day-to-day and they just forget it. And that's 80 to 85% of what they call scrap learning. Now, I couldn't afford for that to happen with CQ. So I brought in Emma, and I want you to get some feedback actually from what Emma said, a reminder that she's a global leader in what she did, and she decided to keep her hand in and involve herself by delivering some of the RIBA coaching herself. And she's been running her business for 20 years. She said 20,000 coaching conversations. And she said this: I just wanted to share, Marsha, I've never in my whole working life been so proud of what we're achieving for an organization than this work with the RIBA through the collaboration with you, CQ, and the transfer of learning to action. I could have easily been moved to tears more than once today as I spoke to your people for the insights, efforts, and true change they're creating. The only sadness is that it's confidential. I really hope they share the depth of it in a review. Progress is truly phenomenal. I can't wait till we share some of it with Dave Livermore and the team too. They'll be blown away with the progress and outcomes. I hope you're suitably proud of the work. And then also a colleague shared with me, I've been meaning to get in touch to tell you how interesting and fulfilling the CQ training has been for me. Thank you so much for encouraging the organization to invest in it. I had no idea what to expect, but it's really changed my way of seeing, hearing, and interpreting what's going on around me. With that clearer insight, I've genuinely become more confident in how I behave towards other people. I'd like to say life-changing, although that might sound overly dramatic. Certainly, it's made me a better person and a stronger manager. So that's what I'm doing with CQ at the RIBA.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. And you hadn't shared that with me before, so this is not scripted between us, but you know, while we're very grateful that our research and work can be a piece of it, we know well that it takes a leader like yourself to really figure out how to implement it in a unique organization. We often say sometimes the biggest test of our own CQ is figuring it out how it fits the organizational culture of the places where we find ourselves. And I know that you've done a whole lot there related to that. More things that we want to interact with you about, and I can see the questions are piling up from participants. I'm going to bring Ritika back in here, who's going to join our conversation. So Ritika, this also wasn't scripted, but I'm going to put you on the spot for a second. We were actually just having an informal conversation the other day about architecture and the way that it reflects different gender stereotypes, et cetera. And it's probably for those of you who are of a different gender than me, it's probably a very basic insight, but share just your passing comment that you made to me about the construction of buildings and bathrooms.
Gosh, Dave, talk about putting me in a spot. Our conversations are confidential, by the way. Just so you know. Right, we were talking about, Dave and I were just talking about genders and how, you know, Marsha reading Invisible Woman. I know you're a big fan of that book yourself. So in that, the example that the author gives is about designing a world designed by men for men. So when they were designing restrooms in malls, it came down to, oh yeah, let's be fair and equitable and divide the space by half. There was no woman on the board making that decision or deciding that actually women need more time in the toilets because they could be pregnant, they have other issues, you know, it's just things that are not taken into consideration. And this is where representation counts. This is where different perspectives really count when we, you know, design or work for people that are part of the community and society. So yeah,
I love that. Ritika, I haven't had a chance to tell you this, but after you shared that with me when we were talking confidentially last week, I shared this great insight with my wife, and she was like, duh, like, yes, that's an obvious kind of, so she didn't see it as nearly as profound as I did. It's kind of like, yeah, that's lived reality every time I use a public restroom. But at any rate,
those queues, right? We you know, all the women standing in the queues look at the men's queue. What like, why can't what?
Right, exactly.
Right? And then all the, you know, children, women with children, they take their kids with them. Generally, children go, I mean, these are sweeping statements, but children go with their mom. So yeah, anyway.
Right. And then as someone has rightfully noted in the chat, and then, you know, there's been a lot of appropriate interaction, talk about gender neutral restrooms, and then where do those fit with all this as well. So I don't want to digress too far down that, but Marsha, when you were just talking about the significance of how RIBA
Buildings
from behind the scenes shapes all of our lives, it just occurred to me of that timely conversation we had. Well, Ritika, I know you want to kind of move, you want to get out of being the one
put
being
you
asked
in the spot,
questions.
right? You thought you were getting away from it. Right. So Dave, the Cultural Intelligence Center works with organizations all over the globe. And so, you know, how does Marsha's use of CQ at RIBA compare with how other organizations are using CQ to support their DEI efforts? So what have you seen? What have you experienced with that?
Yeah, well, I see so many familiar faces in the attendance list, and Marsha would know this as well. My response is usually, it depends. But to unpack that a bit further, so I think some similarity to what you've described, Marsha, is, you know, so many of the organizations we talk about starting at the leadership level and saying, you know, we have to get buy-in there, leadership commitment. it. And it's wonderful where, you were very direct in your Marsha way coming in saying, this is what I'm looking for. I'm putting words in your mouth, sort of, but don't hire me if you're not willing to do this, which helped you then have leadership support going through sessions. That'd be similar. Like when we first started working with Starbucks, the felt need was a bit different. So they had already been doing quite a bit of work in diversity, equity, inclusion, and unconscious bias. But as a global organization, part of the frustration was their teams in EMEA or Asia Pacific or other parts of the Americas said, okay, but the way that you frame the diversity conversation, Starbucks, is so US centric, and we appreciate that you have specific needs that are going on in the US context, but those don't relate to what we're facing in Hong Kong or London. It's not that we don't have our own issues. So for them, they were framing cultural intelligence more as here's a shared lexicon, a shared language that allows us to address the DEI issues. But similar to what Marsha has described with RIBA, it started at the leadership level in order to cascade down. In contrast, our engagement with Qatar Airways actually started more ground up. And so for them, the immediate felt need was with cabin services, with crew, and looking at the hundreds of nationalities that they service on board, and said they're going to have to understand that. The interesting thing was, as they got engaged with that, the cabin crew themselves said, actually, my bigger frustrations are with my fellow crew members who I'm on board with, all day long, and then live in hostels with even during off time. And what about our leadership, and how are they demonstrating cultural intelligence? So in their case, it became more of a bottom up. We're now looking at how leadership looks at. So, as being a bit tongue in cheek to say it depends, but it really does have to take on the nature of the organization. That's what I appreciate. What Marsha has done in terms of working so hard to really fit it specifically to the organizational context and the 200-year history of what's there. If I can throw a question back your way, though, Ritika. So you bring a lifetime of experience and passion to this work, but in terms of the formal role on our behalf with the Cultural Intelligence Center, you're a couple months in, and just curious to hear, like, okay, I've been at this, leading the Cultural Intelligence Center for 10 years, engaged in the research for much longer than that. You're coming at it pretty early on and fresh. What are some of your early insights into how does CQ relate to the DEI conversation or EDI conversation in the UK and Europe?
Right. Thanks, Dave. Yeah. So pretty new to the job itself, but I'm going to start answering this question with a sweeping statement for DEI professionals that are on this call. Which is really, anyone and everyone that works in the DEI space does it because they're passionate about diversity and inclusion. And I'm finding more often that is because of their own lived experiences and that burning desire that comes from within to do their part to make the world an equitable place. And this is the sort of people within the space in DEI really wanting to make a difference, and where that comes from. This is why I'm in the job. I mean, I have unlearned a whole load of things and relearned really, and continue to do so in the role that I'm in. So everything about CQ called me to this job because I think CQ really is a strategic link to DEI. And here's why, specifically to the UK audience that we're talking to, but globally as well. I think DEI professionals operating in this space are very meticulous about outcomes. There's this whole, so what? Why are we doing this training, or why are we doing this, and why? What are we going to get out of it? And that's the question constantly asked. And I found that CQ answered that question in a very tangible way of measuring an individual or a team's drive. And what Marsha was referring to in terms of the framework, measuring that drive and knowledge, giving specific actionable plans to work on it if that's what's needed. And then are these individuals and teams planning before the interactions and working with people that are different from them, whether it's race, religion, ethnicity, or any of those characteristics? Are they then actually doing something about it? Are they changing the way that they ensure that these interactions, come from a place of acceptance and respect more than anything else? So to me, the CQ framework that Marsha took us through really well at the start of the webinar, it measures these aspects and provides those who work with them with an actionable development plan. a self-awareness journey. That's what comes out of it. And for me, you know, in 2 months, I myself am on this journey, constantly identifying my own biases and strategies of managing them. So, you know, the assessments that we send, it's the before and the after, a very actionable plan, and everything else in between. And to me, that really is the USP of CQ. This is why, you know, honestly, I can't keep up with the sheer number of clients that are coming to me wanting more information, wanting to work with us, signing up for our products. So really, I mean, great place to be in, and CQ is a complete no-brainer.
Yeah, and I see some of the questions that we'll get to in just a moment kind of are also tapping into some of those things you just mentioned, Ritika, largely like where you landed there on self-awareness and people appropriately asking, how do I even get the conversation going? So there's a lot to digest in terms of what you just shared as early insights that I think are really rich and robust.
So, so question for you, Marsha. This is a three-way. No one's getting away without being burned in this webinar, right? So, Marsha, I mean, gosh, I applied for the CQ job, and then I saw you, all CQ all over LinkedIn, and you were literally, you've been with me even before I got the job, and you were the reason why I felt so passionate about CQ. The way you almost sold it to me, it was amazing. And I'm just, I've heard your presentation, excellent, very passionate. It comes from the heart. It's obvious, and this is why we are in this job. It really, we're in it because this is our purpose. So, at the crux of it, I want to know, why is CQ so important to you? I mean, what's behind your commitment to CQ, and what does it really offer you?
It's all the things you just said, actually, Ritika. I mean, some of these things come from a place of real pain, actually. We go through our personal experiences, difficult ones, racism, sexism, and all the other isms in between, and we start analyzing ourselves and saying, what is it about me that's why don't people like me or accept me for who I am? Why am I a problem? And getting through that really difficult, painful time, I was always asking myself, why don't we listen to voices that are unheard in our society? And I was looking for, we're talking about D&I all the time, but we don't appear to be making any progress. And I was just searching for an answer. And I think that's when I found Dave's book, Leading with Cultural Intelligence. So I got the book first, read the book, thought, oh, this looks interesting. This looks like a real answer, a real framework to help that really important thing, create procedural changes to mitigate hidden bias. It's a framework of behaviors to move you from knowing you want to be better at D&I to actual, tangible, successful outcomes. And when I saw the academic robustness to it, because everyone's always asking, oh, prove it to me, that this works. Well, actually, the CQ Centre can. Similarly, with the McKinsey model, they've got all the proof that they have that it's 8 times more successful when you do both. So bringing the two together just made absolute sense. And so it, like you say, it's a no-brainer in the way that it works. And so you can see tangible outcomes. Let's use it.
Thank you, Marsha. That was brilliant. That's bang on time. We've got 15 minutes for audience questions, and questions are just pouring in. So I'm just going to dive straight in, Marsha and Dave. I'm just looking questions for Marsha. What kinds of hurdles did you have to overcome in implementing EDI at RIBA?
Not many, to be honest. Partly because I suppose the way I presented myself at interview, it was a bit like that, Dave. It was take it or leave it. You either want me or you don't. And so I had buy-in from the CEO and the other execs who had interviewed me, and members of the board who interviewed me as well, that saying, yeah, what you're saying, it makes sense. I suppose to some extent it's the clarity with which I'm able to describe it as well. It helps bring people along. And so once you have, and I think it's really important to have that role modeling piece from the top of the organization, people, I'm given the money, I I did also say, I'll only take the job if I report to the CEO and have a decent budget, both of which I got. And being able to have the money to invest not only in the CQ but in the coaching as well has been absolutely crucial. So that's what's made it easier, because they've said, there you go, Marsha, off you go. And I've been allowed to thrive and do my thing and have the support of a very, very engaged organization.
Thank you, Marsha. I think this question is very pertinent to you, Dave. It comes from Mexico. George, he's asking, after reading Dr. Livermore's books and reviewing the graphs used here, there and here in Marsha's chart, I was thinking if it would be possible to start developing the pyramidal concept for a much more integrated infograph, which can reinforce the concept of collaboration and integration of the 4 CQ parts. He thinks that each one of them is important and it's not hierarchical. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we actually have a research paper that's just about to be published by our colleagues at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, Thomas Rockstall, and our own Lynn Van Dyne at the Cultural Intelligence Center, that looks at some of the ways that the 4 capabilities of CQ do have a compounding effect on each other. And without getting too theoretical on it, I think perhaps to your point, if I understand it, Jorge, the sum is more than just the total of the parts kind of thing. And so when you talk about the design of it, that's beyond my pay grade, but I wholeheartedly hear what you're saying. It's one of the things that we are talking with our graphic designers about and others who have expertise of how do we not just make this a linear model. Even the framework that Marsha showed, or the diagram that Marsha showed for the 4 capabilities, some people have been saying to me more recently, yeah, just the fact that it's rectangles makes it look so kind of hard and square, and how do we make it seem more organic and dynamic? And you're right. I think the research bears out that it's not hierarchical, that there's some progression to it. There's a reason why we talk about you have to have the motivation and interest that then drives your understanding and knowledge that moves into strategy and action. But even it's not a perfect process that always walks through. And the last thing I would say related to that, in our previous webinar that we did, I talked about the potential danger of overemphasizing knowledge, which is what typically happens in response to EDI initiatives. Let's teach more people about gender differences or differently abled people or different ethnicities or the history of the UK or whatever it might be. And the research is showing again and again that knowledge by itself is not only not enough, but it actually can be dangerous. So all that to say, I'm not giving a very succinct answer to Jorge's question, but I do think we need the artists of the world to help us think about how to communicate these very abstract academic ideas in ways that really resonate, to kind of demonstrate, as you said, a more integrated approach rather than it just kind of being this abstract model that lives apart from it.
Well, can I just say, talk about high CQ, Dave. You even got Jorge's name right. I mean, gosh, that's from Mexico. I'm sorry, I got it wrong, but there you go. Thank you for correcting that. Thanks, Dave. Marsha, question for you. I think it's important. It comes from Kimberly. I think it's important to start the internal conversation. Do you have suggestions or strategies to initiate that internal conversation in a safe manner so that each person can begin recognizing their own biases so we can begin our work as an organization with the EDI?
How do you start the conversation in the organization? Is that a summary of the question? What would you say?
That would be, yes.
Gosh, how do you start the conversation? I mean, the thing is, the conversation's happening. And if the conversation's not happening in your organization, then that's worrying. I would say that it's happening in the world, whether it's in the news, Dave just mentioned an incident, and there's so much going on in lives, and everyone's individual lives within the organization as well will be impacted in some way by this nature that we are not all equal, we're not treated equitably. And so just by looking out the window and bringing that conversation in, there's got to be something that your senior leadership is having. And if they're not, then yeah, absolutely bring it to their attention, because if they won't be fit for purpose for much longer if they're not really encapsulating and embracing the richness of our diversity of our lived world and creating an inclusive environment within the four walls of the organization. So there must be so many things going on, whether it's a religious holiday through to something in the news that will allow that conversation to open. And if you're not having it, I have to wonder about some of the people in the organization who are going through some very difficult times because of what's going on in the outside world, and it's not really being recognized. So maybe in the first instance, if there's something going on in the outside world that, you know, you can see someone who has a particular characteristic and might be affecting them, to go and support that person as well, in, you know, to support our colleagues from underrepresented groups so that they can start to be their whole selves at work. Yeah.
No, absolutely, Marsha. And someone's just said data. I mean, you know, my understanding is really the two things that can start any conversations, depending on, I'm a big fan of heart-led or head-led leaders and managers that we talk to. And so data and dialogue, if you combine that, that really is, you know, that's irrefutable conversation. So
yeah. I completely agree about the data. I always say, though, that data should inform the journey rather than drive it. And the reason why I say that is because if you're waiting for data, you're not just observing what is clearly you know, apparent around you. So I'm a woman of action, so I say start, you know, you don't need to wait for the data, but the data will help inform and monitor you as you go along, and you know, start to help. But certainly, you know, in terms of having those conversations, yes.
May I interject one other thought? Many of you know that one of the reasons that we start some of the CQ workshops with the cultural values is to sort of gently get at how to even engage people in the conversation. So while I'm all about we need to expose people to bias and to privilege and to some of the hard-hitting facts related to it, given that people who look like me are often resistant to even starting it. If you start of, hey, let's just look at some of the difference that exists in our preference for direct versus indirect communication and the differences that we have around time orientation, there can tend to be a little bit more like, oh, okay, you're going to help me with that too. And then, oh, and by the way, we also have some biases. So I think also data in a very up close personal, like here's the data from your assessment. And so the tool for me is often, as much as anything, about that first step toward the self-awareness that you were talking about, Ritika. I guess this is being recorded, but I don't really care how people score on the tool. I mean, I do, but what's more important to me is it a burning platform to go, okay, I actually need to pay attention to this.
Absolutely, Dave. There's a really interesting question come in, which is saying, can Marsha and David speak to CQ coaching, its framework and functions? How do we offer this critical service for leaders to rebuff scrap learning?
Yeah, so if I can take that, just to be clear, it's not specific CQ coaching. It's transfer of learning into action coaching. So actually it's applicable to any learning. And what it does is you do your learning, whatever it is. In my case, of course, I'm delivering CQ learning. The participants are then encouraged to make an action plan based on what they've learned, something that's meaningful to them, something that's going to progress them within the next few months, something that is goal-oriented. And when they have made this action plan with 3 things in it, they then have coaching sessions to calibrate where they are with those particular objectives. So they calibrate themselves on a number 1 to 10. So when they're starting, they're probably quite low, 1 or 2. And then they go through the coaching, and the coaching asks them questions. How are you going about this? What are you doing to improve your score? How are you going to move that score up? And they have that every few weeks. So that after sort of 3 months, at least with those 3 goals, they would have moved themselves forward from being where they were to actually implementing their learning in a very specific way. And that's where the progress has been within the organization, because they're looking at their own roles They're looking at what they can do to apply their CQ lens to whatever it is they do, whether it's professional services, whether it's external comms, whether it's dealing with people in the library, and being able to move themselves forward in working and relating effectively with those who are different from them. And that's how it works. And so then we regroup at the end. But that's the purpose of the coaching, to help them implement their learning.
Thank you, Marsha. Dave, I think this one's for you, and probably have just enough time to answer that question before we wrap up. Please give us some simple examples to implement DEI in educational institutes. You've done a lot of work around the world with educational institutes. What's your thoughts on that, Dave?
Wow. Yeah, I won't begin to do it justice, but I think in many regards, similar to what we've talked about with some of the corporate examples, figuring out what's in it for me, for the individual. So for example, if you're trying to get faculty engaged in the conversation, it's probably less likely that at least a reluctant faculty member is going to be interested in it just because it's a diversity initiative, but rather, hey, haven't you noticed that it's harder and harder to engage with the students in your classroom and to understand what their needs are? So how do you specifically tailor the training, the coaching for being more effective in the classroom? Whereas for administrator, how do you want to ensure that you're not the next one being faced with a lawsuit because you've just been accused of discrimination or not having accessible, et cetera? And then for students, hey, how are you equipped for the job prospect? So I apologize for making it so extrinsic oriented, because I certainly do want to get it to the heart level eventually. I just think realistically, you have to start with the what's in it for me and how does it actually help me fulfill what I've come to this educational institution to do, and then take it further. But we do have a number of institutions around the world who have taken what I just said much deeper. So our team would be happy to connect with you further to kind of give some real kind of structure to what I just kind of threw out there as high level ideas.
Thanks, Dave. And, just keeping tab of the time, really, I wanted to thank you both so much for the wonderful insights, both Marsha and Dr. Livermore. I thoroughly enjoyed listening to it. It was great learning from me, and I'm sure the audience did as well. Great chat and feedback from the audience already. I wanted to thank everyone from the bottom of our hearts for your time and being here today, listening to us. Announcements, right. For those in the UK, Dr. Livermore will be in London at the end of October, in person, in flesh, in blood, and I might rope Marsha in as well, depending on popular demand. But we're hosting an in-person event on the 26th of October at 10 a.m. in Covent Garden. And details are on our website. Marsha, Dave, and myself are on LinkedIn as well. We've got details on that. So hope to see you there. Also, the third of our webinar series is next month. We are commemorating Black History Month in the UK, and 14th of October at 3 p.m. Mark your dates in your diary for the UK. Please save that date, and hopefully we'll see you there. Thank you again for attending, everyone.